on this?
Sure, Chairman Brissett. The Alamo Defenders Descendant Association has filed several unverified cemetery notices for the Alamo. This one was sent and considered for this particular review. The unverified cemetery application is asking to define the entire area bounded by the 1836 walls of the Alamo to be defined as the unverified cemetery based on a combination of historical and archaeological research, including the research in the chapel. After review by staff, we certainly agree that the chapel does have intact burials and should be considered a cemetery. However, we don't feel at this point that there is sufficient evidence to warrant an unverified cemetery designation for the entirety of the Alamo area. And we feel that the existing historic Texas cemetery designation is sufficient. So therefore, we're recommending denial of the unverified cemetery application.
Thank you, Brad. Committee members, any comments?
Well, Steve Peterson again. The historic Texas cemetery designation does not, according to what I read, does not affect any use of the property as it sits now. If we do make a cemetery out of the entire property or something like that, unverified or verified, what uses would that prohibit? Do we know?
Yes, I'll ask Dave Gordon to speak to that.
Thank you, Chairman Brissett. This is Dave Gordon. I'm going to reference one portion of the Health and Safety Code, Chapter 711, Section, I believe it's 010, states that the owner of a property on which an unknown cemetery is discovered or on which an abandoned cemetery is located may not construct improvements on the property in a manner that would disturb the cemetery. So there is an argument that a designation of a cemetery, whether it's unknown, abandoned, or other type of cemetery, but not an unverified cemetery, would prohibit construction unless the remaining provisions of that statute were followed through, which requires a written order of the state registrar and perhaps an order of a district court. So that's the source of an encumbrance on any construction, 711.010.
And construction, could that be construed to mean moving dirt, period, anywhere in the area?
Probably, but that's hard to say. So the language of the statute says may not construct improvements on the property.
Right. Yeah, I know. This is just more of this whole thing. So, okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
Members, any other comments or questions? I want to point out that the new evidence that has been brought forward in this notice is the evidence of 4 excavation units inside the church where human remains were found. I think we've dealt with that new information in the previous notice and the motion that we approved. So looking at the remainder of the area being recommended to be an unverified cemetery, we have no new evidence. And I should mention that a very similar notice of an unverified cemetery came to us at our July commission meeting last year, and at that time the commission felt like there was not sufficient evidence of entrustment still being intact or present in that area. And I also want to point out that this issue is still an issue that probably will come before us in the future. As we know, there's going to be archaeological investigations taking place at the Alamo, particularly as many of the utility lines are put in and are impacting the ground. So evidence for or against an undiversified cemetery, archaeological evidence may be coming forward to us in the future. So I think that's important to point out that whatever action we take today is not the final say on this, but the archaeological work will help us determine what is the final say at a later date. So at this point, I have a motion that I'm going to move forward, and I move that the committee send forward to the commission and recommend that. Yes. So is the applicant going to be able to address the committee before a vote? It's Art Martinez, I'm sorry. That's the question. Yes, please go ahead and address the committee. We don't have a question for you, but my question is, what are your concerns and comments? Sure.
Good morning.
My comments. Okay. Go ahead, Lee. Go first.
Okay. As we all know, this is a very unique situation. This site is like no other. As most of you might remember, back in July of 2019, we came before you with a overwhelming amount of archival evidence stating that there would be a burial and a coffin inside the church, and sure enough, that's what happened. And so we're coming back to you today to say the same thing, and I hate to hear that it will be, after we've done all of this construction and we find bodies and we're back to the same spot and our bodies have been moved, the Alamo defenders are not yet allowed to say a prayer, etc. You already know my feeling on DNA. James Ivey, a very well-known Alamo archaeologist, has publicly stated that, about DNA testing, about remains. He and I have spoken. At the end of the day, we're sitting here with the same situation we did inside the church. And I at this point, really am not sure of, the impact of the Alamo Reimagine plan, but, and I'm not an attorney, but I can tell you that I don't think redoing some flagstone would make any difference. But again, I just want to go back to say the Alamo archaeologists, and I think if you look in your packet, actually found human remains on the west wall. We also have all of those archival records stating that we have remains all over that site. So I'm going to say again, listen, the whole thing is a cemetery. We even have Santa Ana's report saying who rolled the foreigners' bodies in the ditches and in the entrenchments. So again, I would ask that you approve this, and maybe you need to make some type of modifications. I don't know. But I really do feel like it should be protected by the state.
Ms. White, thank you for your comments. I think, do we have is there another question or comment by a submitter under this notice of unverified cemetery by Lee Spencer White?
Yes, sir. I know that we have Jerry Patterson on the line that would like to address.
Yes. This is Jerry Patterson, and I understand that. Of course, we all now agree that the area inside the chapel has made that designation. You've just done so, and I think while you can argue that the entire Alamo footprint, as it was in 1836, may not include internments, I think that all would agree that a substantial portion of that area does include internments, and I don't think it's interment is required. I think if you're laid to rest, or if you come to rest at the point of your death, that qualifies. And I think that there is no one that will deny that the expanse extends far beyond the chapel itself. And I also think that if that designation were made, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the likelihood of DNA testing of remains that will be found, additional remains that will be found, no matter what proceeds after today, will add to the body of history. And I would think that the Texas Historical Commission has a duty to add to the body of history. So if in fact the commission is inclined to approve the motion that's on the table now to deny the request, I think a caveat might be added that we recognize there are areas we will be open and will proceed in that direction. But just merely brushing it away, to me, is I really think not the right thing to do. And this goes to the bigger part of history that we all know, and so those of us, all of you and myself, I'm a student of history, and I emphasize students. But all too often, we look back 15 years hence on something that was done that was thought to be the right thing to do at that point in time, and we look at it, and we say, no, we wish we had done that. I'm just saying that we all know there's more to it than just what's in the chapel, and that some consideration should be given to definitively committing the THC to looking in that direction as we continue, if this motion that's on the floor now does in fact pass.
Mr. Patterson, thank you for your comment. I should note that the commission has made the cemetery under a separate part of the commission statutes and administrative code, historic Texas cemetery, indicating that there is information. Here under the health and safety code, we're looking for evidence, and that's where I think we, at present, looking at all the evidence, we come up short to fulfill the exact definition of the health and safety code at this time. And as I mentioned, there's going to be what I think will be extensive archaeological investigation elsewhere, and I think this issue is going to come back before us, and I think we will have better information and the evidence we need to address this issue. So with that, I'm going to move that the committee send forward to the... I'm sorry, one more sentence that... Who's speaking right now? Oh, I'm sorry, this is Art Martinez, attorney for Alamo Defenders Descendants Association. We have 3 speakers signed up. I don't know if I could use our last slot before the committee votes. Okay, I will ask you the question. What are your comments? Please keep them brief, please. Certainly. So the question was just raised is, what is the evidence? And let me give you a brief overview. So we have the Mexican Army official report saying that foreigners were buried in ditches and entrenchments. We've got 1846 and 49 Alamo Defender skeletons, partial skeletons were found inside the church by the U.S. Army. 1866, human remains were found during the Gibbs building construction. In 1878, a green coffin and several skulls, including one with light-colored hair, one with knife wounds in his forehead, were found near the church. 1887, human bones were unearthed at the current site of the federal building. In 1920, half-cremated bodies were found below a garage floor near the Alamo wall. 1934, 20 human bone fragments that appear to be burned were discovered on the site. 1934, the Work Progress Administration found human bones doing landscaping outside in the front of the church. 1935, skeletons were found during tree planting at the current federal building's post office. 1936-37, 4 bodies were found while placing flagstone floors near the church. 1936, WPA workmen found a coffin appearing to be made of wagon planks inside the church. 1979 and 80, a skull was found by UTSA archaeologist Anne Fox, showing sword marks on his forehead. She stated it was from a battle. 1979, human remains were found along the west wall by archaeologist James Ivey from the Center for Archaeological Research at UTSA. And of course, in 2019, we have human remains found that were just previously discussed by the KLO. We also have reinterments by the Toptilan Coatecan Nation to reinterments on the site. So there is ample and overwhelming evidence of human remains, bodies, burials, coffins throughout the site that's very well documented, but unverified by any of the people listed in the statute. And so I think that an honest reading of the statute and a review of the archaeological and archival evidence, plus the 1,300 records of burials and the mission burial book, clearly show that let's go through the definition. It's a location, clearly it's a location. Some evidence of internment. There's overwhelming evidence of internment. But the presence of one or more of these unmarked graves has not been verified by a person, as you read the list previously, or by the Texas Historical Commission. So this meets every element of the definition. And what we believe should happen is that an unverified cemetery should be designated, and that a cemetery delineation survey should be required of the GLO and the Alamo Trust to determine the boundaries of the cemetery and where the graves are located. And so, frankly, I think to argue that against designation because it's going to impede the construction of improvements shows discriminatory intent. The whole purpose of the Texas Historical Commission is to protect historical sites, not to assist construction by state agencies. And you're asking.
We need to move on. I'm sorry, we need to move on. We appreciate those comments. You've submitted those comments in writing. We've considered those. I should say that with the exception of the 4 interments in the church, the evidence of the other interments looks like those remains have been removed from the area. And so I come down to the existing evidence.
Remember, there were 2 reinterments by the Second Nation. They're still on the site.
Okay, so at this point,
which is outside of the building.
Okay, please, sir. At this point, I want to move forward my motion, and we as a committee will debate the motion. So I move that the committee send forward to the commission and recommend that the evidence provided in the notice of unverified cemetery submitted by the Alamo Defenders Descendants Association, as well as responses to the notice, are not sufficient to support the existence of a cemetery in the area described in the notice. And so at this point, members, would a member like to make a second?
Dave Peterson, second.
Okay, any further discussion, members of the committee? Hearing none, let me call for a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So everybody approves of the motion? Is that what I heard?
Yes.
Okay. The motion carries. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now to item 3C, notice of unverified cemetery submitted by